On this timeline, the destruction of the temple and the exile to Babylon is marked by the end of the Blue Biblical period about here. Judah had many rulers after the Babylonians had captured it, including Alexander the Great of Greece. But over the generations, the Seleucid Greek rule became more oppressive until they took over Solomon's temple and desecrated it. Eventually, the Maccabee freedom fighters managed to drive out the Greeks in 164 before the Common Era and rededicate the temple and re-establish the local rule, the story of Hanukkah. The Hasmonean dynasty, developed from the Maccabees, continued a troublesome rule for a century. But then the Romans conquered Jerusalem and appointed kings to rule on their behalf. Herod's family lived in Edom, roughly today's country of Jordan, across the Jordan River on Israel's east. They joined the Judean religion under the Hasmonean rule. After the rededication of the temple, we celebrate at Hanukkah, but they would not have known of the story of 1 day's oil lasting 8 days, since that was only recorded 600 years after those events. Herod was about 11 years old when the Romans conquered Jerusalem. When he was about 33, the Romans appointed Herod as a client king to rule Judea. The year was 37 before the Common Era, which tells us we're approaching the period of an influential teacher of the Judeans who will become known as Jesus. Herod will reign for 33 years until 4 before the Common Era. So behind me is a statue of Herod. He may look armless enough, but he's mentioned in the Christian Gospel of Matthew as the ruler of Judea who orders the killing of innocent children around Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Although most experts do not believe this is a true story, it seems to be a parallel to the story told in the book of Exodus of Pharaoh killing the Israelite male babies in Egypt. The gospel writer wants to create a miraculous survival story for Jesus to equate him to Moses, who survived by being floated down the Nile and found by Pharaoh's daughter. Herod will become known for his colossal building projects. He tries to buy favor with the Judeans by vastly expanding the small second temple that the returning exiles had built when they came back from Babylon into something even bigger and grander than the first temple built by King Solomon had been. His architects, though, faced a challenge: how to expand it to make it bigger than the hilltop, the Temple Mount, that was to contain it. Their solution was to build a massive retaining wall in the adjacent valley to the west, with stones so huge we still don't know to this day how they were moved. They then filled in the space behind this wall to create an expanded level area above it, into which they built the huge extensions to the Second Temple. This wall can still be seen and is iconic to Jerusalem, and it's now known worldwide as the Western Wall. Many Jews still consider it to be the holiest place in the world, as it is closest to where the temple stood before it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. Many trips to Jerusalem land at Ben Gurion Airport and take participants straight to the wall before they even go to their hotel. And they are now building a station for the new fast train from the airport, so you can stop at the wall first. Now, we should remember that it was not the wall of the temple, but a retaining wall holding up the platform. The temple was built above it, probably about the position that the Golden Dome of the Rock now stands. We now know from archaeology that there is an even more significant place to visit called the Ophel, or the Southern Archaeological Gardens. That is the way that our ancient ancestors between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago would climb the 15 great steps to the Temple Mount, enter the gates, and take their offerings to the priests. The steps have been uncovered, and you can still marvel at them and even climb them, some repaired and reconstructed, but some still smooth and worn by the feet of our ancient ancestors. The people from all over Judah would take the offerings of the first fruits and produce of their harvests 3 times a year to celebrate the late spring festival of Pesach, the barley harvest, the early summer festival of Shavuot, the wheat harvest, and the autumn festival of Sukkot, which marks the conclusion of the agricultural year. King Herod, the great builder, not only wanted to keep the Jerusalemites happy, but he also wanted to keep the Roman Emperor Caesar happy as well. So he built an entirely new city on the Mediterranean coast and named it Caesarea. Reliable water supplies are crucial for any population, especially in desert countries. His architects built a huge aqueduct to feed water from the distant hills, which is still there to this day. However, Herod was not trusted or popular and was worried about being overthrown. Over his lifetime, this became a paranoia, and he had several of his family members, including his wife Mariamne and 3 of his sons, executed because he suspected them of plotting to overthrow him. So he didn't want to go too far from Jerusalem, but he wanted to stay protected. About 30 years before the Common Era commenced, he built himself a huge palace fortress 12 kilometers south of Jerusalem, which he called Herodion, whose distinctive shape can be seen for miles. But Jerusalem gets cold and wet in winter, so he also traveled 100 kilometers further southeast into the Judean desert near the Dead Sea, the lowest place on earth. And there, on the northern face of a huge natural fortress called Masada, overlooking the Dead Sea, he built a fabulous series of palaces that would stay warm from the desert breezes through the winter. As at Caesarea, water supply is crucial and even more challenging and amazing in the desert. Herod's engineers carved a series of huge cisterns around the top of Masada. The engineers knew that even the desert had occasional rain and it can cause flash flooding, so they built dams and channels and an aqueduct to channel water to Masada's new cisterns. Today, no visit to Israel is complete without seeing the remains at Masada, which have been carefully excavated and reconstructed. When Herod does die, the Romans divided his kingdom among 3 of his surviving sons and his sister. Because one son was called Herod Antipas and one grandson was Herod Agrippa, you have to be careful to know which one people mean when they say Herod. Both the temple and Masada will become central to our story as it moves in its next stages.